when we talk about what's next, what's beta next, we're not just thinking about the guests for beta. We should be thinking about the leaders of alpha.
Right.
How are we moving them along too, right? We don't want them to get stuck in just ministering a certain way. We want to tend to their spiritual journey also.
Welcome to Divine Renovation's Missional Leadership Podcast. Here's your host, Tammy LeBlanc.
Hi, and welcome to another episode. Always great to see you guys. Welcome, Matt. Welcome, Rob. Rob, you're just getting back in town, I believe. You were traveling this week?
Yeah, I was out of town for a couple of days at a conference for pastors in my denomination. So,
How'd those go?
they were great. We had a speaker from the U.S. who I've heard before, and just an original thinker. And one of the sessions we had with him is he had kind of a discipleship pathway, leadership pipeline that he used in his church. He was kind of sharing that with us. And his key strategy is to help the people in his church embrace and engage in marketplace ministry. And he's forming them to be shepherds in their workplace. It was a fun environment to be in and kind of just exposed to some of the same thinking that we wrestle with here, but yet at the same time, kind of a different vision and a different focus than I think we wrestled with before. So it's kind of very stimulating and engaging, and really enjoyed being part of it.
It's interesting, Rob, that you bring up that marketplace ministry. You know, we do have some churches that kind of wrestle in that spot. And actually, one of mine just this week talking about what they want to do in Lent, because, you know, Catholics, we tend to think it's seasons, and they're going to do a marketplace Stations of the Cross, like a live Stations of the Cross, reenacting those Stations of the Passion. And so they're going all in real deep, real fast. They're not like trying to warm up people. It's just going to like hit them straight between the eyes with that one. So we'll see. It's, at least I like the thinking. Maybe starting with other little shallower approaches is also a good thing to add in too, but we'll see what happens.
So curious, Matt, but when you say like a marketplace Stations of the Cross, what's that like? Is this like out in the marketplace? They're going to have different stations, kind of a thing?
So it's in South Africa, so I have no frame of reference for what the place looks like, but they mentioned like a shopping center, like a shopping district or a mall kind of feel. So maybe they'll get booed, maybe people will come to Jesus, and maybe people will come back to church all at the same time.
Wow, that's brave of them. Matt, you'll have to fill us in on how that goes.
I will.
Future podcast.
I will.
Cool.
You know, this morning, I did my daily trip to so it's called a hydroponic planter, I guess. But anyway, it's new to us. And so we come to it, and every day we're kind of excited to see, is there any new growth? And I was standing back and I was thinking how funny it is that we're all drawn to this. But there's something kind of exciting about growth, isn't there? Like when you think about, for those of us that have kids, same idea. We take such delight in these various stages of growth. And tell me if I push this too far, but it actually got me thinking about the topic of today's podcast. And so today we are talking about accompaniment of people on the journey after Alpha, appreciating that not every parish is running Alpha, but that's the one that's most common for parishes that we encounter to use as their evangelization strategy. And this visit to the garden got me thinking about that space that we're going to call beta that comes after Alpha. And what does it look like to help people take a next step into another space? So they've been evangelized, but what comes next?
Those are always fun topics. I think back to when coaching with churches and being in the local church, being in the local parish, and just wrestling with those dynamics of our people growing and how are they growing and how are we helping them take steps towards it and all that stuff, I think is, I don't know, I not speak for others, but that was one of the funnest things that I've enjoyed doing in ministry.
I think what we tend to do is we like to go to the grocery store and buy the things already grown and cut. Like we like to go eat the fruit at the store, right? And maybe there's an analogy there, right? If we're going to go on this growing thing that I don't know. I think we like to see things grow, but I think we like to see mature growth rather than the little sprouts and the saplings. Yeah. So we don't do I don't think we do as much planting, right? I think we do a lot more like, hey, we'll take those that are already disciples. We'll take those that have already come to faith, are already living out their faith, and let's see them grow.
Yeah.
So we like growth, but I think we like the mature growth more than the beginnings.
I would agree. We like seeing it. We don't like waiting for it.
That virtue of patience that we all need to pray for.
Which is why I don't have a greenhouse at my house, Tammy.
Though the beauty in this one is the herbs actually grow a little bit quicker.
Tammy, I think you should clarify when you say herbs, because that means different things to certain people. We've had raids in our city of people growing herbs illegally in their house.
Okay. So just to be very, very clear, we are growing parsley and we're trying to grow chives, but they have yet to show themselves. Basil's going really well. Cilantro's going really well. And thyme is coming up pretty good.
Good. I'm glad. This is a family show.
Okay, so guys, let's then talk about what role does a post-alpha program, we kind of sometimes give it the name beta, just to follow alpha, but what role does a good beta or post-alpha group play in accompanying someone in their faith journey?
It's, I think, one of the most important and one of the hardest for churches to wrestle with and figure out. Because a lot of times we'll step into the space and we'll start running alpha. And we have a lot of history, with alphas being run, and they kind of give you the playbook and what that looks like. But as soon as you start to say what's next, it's a little bit more open-ended. And I think different churches, whether your context, size, all that sort of stuff, it's going to look different. So this requires, I think, a little bit more discernment and a little bit more experimentation to try to think in terms of what this looks like. At a high level, I think, as churches are wrestling with this, you want to think in terms of, okay, like if you have like a discipleship pathway in place or something along those lines, which, it's something we talk about in other environments here at DR, and trying to think in terms of how are we helping people take next steps. And I think at a high level, before we kind of break it open too much around this, one of the things in general that I would say when churches wrestle with this is that we have to think in terms of relationship more than we have to think in terms of like information or program. Mm-hmm. And so how can we help people take the next relational step in the process? And again, this gets back to thinking in terms of, okay, who is it that you're actually connecting with in your alpha? So are you connecting with people who are completely unchurched? Are you connecting with people who are fallen away Catholic? So they have a little bit of understanding of Catholicism, but maybe not a lot about your parish. Are you connected with people who are already in the pews and they already have a connection, in your parish? So, and probably alphas in general have maybe a mix of those people. Hopefully they have a mix of those people. And so it's always going to look a little bit different or feel a little bit different in each of those different categories. But beginning out of the gate, you want to think in terms of how do we help people take a next step relationally in this, as opposed to going down, okay, people have come to faith, and so, we need to teach them how to pray, and we need to teach them about, attending mass. We need, we get into all the information piece, which is not unimportant. But if you think in terms of information first and relationship second, you're going to see a lot of people move on. If you think of relationship first and information and teaching second, you will connect a lot more people.
Mm-hmm. That's really key. I want to highlight that because those are two different almost directions that you could take your beta group is, yes, this content, this information, this teaching versus, this idea of community and journeying and accompanying someone. Good to have those two mindsets, I think, as you're experimenting and playing with different ideas. Nice job.
Just to kind of frame that up too, I think we're really good at doing these two things in the church now is creating a pathway of information. Got that down. The other is creating a pathway for socialization. And you could argue some churches do it better than others. But I think the key here is how we merge these two together. Like I can think of a bunch of social groups at my parish that might open in prayer, but other than that, the only thing that makes them connected to the church is that they meet at the church. Or a group starts at the church and it goes to someone's house and becomes like a group, but you probably wouldn't call it a small group because they never really talk about faith. They just watch the latest episode of their favorite show and drink wine, which is, it's good, right? That's fine. But we're calling those like small groups often. Or we take a group and say, okay, it's more about the what than the who. So we're going to just give you information. It's going to be strictly catechetical, no relationship building. The test here is that you showed up, that you got the information and you passed the test or whatever. But imagine if we could take those two together, right? That's really, I think, an alpha. We start to see these things come together. And I think that needs to be a premise for beta. And to remember, right? Alpha's named that for a reason. It's the beginning point. It's not alpha and omega, right? It's alpha. So when we talk about beta, there's not, by the way, just for people listening, like, oh, I see the show notes. We should look up what the beta program is. That's just kind of the term for that space after alpha, right? To frame up that there is a next step. There is not a beta that I'm aware of, although I'm sure a lot of people are trying to market that right now. So
I think some churches have kind of done their own thing and put that name on it, but there's no branded, promoted program out there that I think people are going to find with that name. Yeah.
We want to open that space now and start to talk about like what are all the kinds of possibilities and things that people are doing in this space, right?
Yeah, right. And one more point just to make to help frame it up for where we go, because I mean, I feel like there's the floodgates of stuff we could talk about today with this. But to remember that when we talk about beta or the what's next on that, our discipleship journey, our accompaniment of people, it assumes a lot about your alpha. Because we know a lot of times people are like, hey, we started alpha this semester. We better start something for beta this semester too. There's a timing of this. There's a critical mass of people that needs to be considered. I've seen a lot of things fail in the beta world because they haven't figured out the alpha world first. So I think that needs to be held in tension too. And some churches will say like they start their like what's next quite a bit later, even if they have some like what's next to hold the space until they've really developed that pathway out.
Yeah, it's a good point, Matt, because there's only so many resources that you're starting out with, and you don't want to pull everybody from alpha to put into running and hosting and journeying and accompanying with and beta and whatnot. So it's a good point to really, really land that solid foundation with your evangelization program first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good point because you always do want to make sure that you've got your alpha culture established first and kind of build off of that or from that, and not use all of the people resources from that and suck the life out of alpha for sure. That's a key point. Definitely as you move forward with this thing. And around that, and again, this is just a rule of thumb. This will depend on different churches, but historically, in thinking through this step, we've always said you want to run at least 3 alphas at a minimum, and maybe you need to do more. And this is more of a discernment, judgment call thing to make sure that you're able to start whatever is next without sacrificing what's happening in alpha.
So guys, maybe as we start to break this open a bit deeper, would a good place to start be what kinds of outcomes should parish be looking for in their post-alpha groups? What are they trying to achieve in these groups?
Definitely one of the right questions. I'd say, beginning around some of that, you want to just ask the basic question of, as you figure out who you're kind of reaching, what's your retention rate after alpha? So if you have an alpha and you have 50 guests, from that alpha, 6 months after alpha is over, how many are you still able to see connected to the parish and can identify with, right? And again, we don't want the next steps to be only relational. We do want there to be faith development in the midst of this, but prioritizing the relational connection in this. Years ago, there was a book called Sticky Church by Larry Osborne, and he was talking about the whole idea of Velcro, and Velcro is made up of hooks and loops, right? And the more hooks and loops that you have kind of connecting each other, the stronger the Velcro is. And that was kind of the image that he was using in the book. And so you want to think in terms of helping people, be connected relationally. So moving forward, you want to begin to think in terms of, okay, what are we going for here? And begin to prepare to think in terms of what is the long-term retention rate. And so as you're thinking through what the next steps are, what the next strategies are, you want to have in place something that's going to give you that feedback. A lot of churches, again, this is where we've kind of seen a lot of experimentation in this place, because a lot of churches have run great alphas, and, they've seen a lot of people come to faith, and then all of a sudden it's like, so-and-so, came to our parish and, had a powerful encounter with Jesus, and it just seemed to be great, and they seemed to be on fire and all this sort of stuff. And like 3 months after Alpha was done, they were done, right? And so thinking in terms of, what is the long-term prospect that we're helping people move through to take the next steps, and how are we journeying with them and really, shepherding them in this process to stay connected so that we are aware that they're on this journey.
Yeah, Rob, you mentioned this in a previous webinar we did on small groups, which, by the way, I think at the end of this we mentioned is a great tool for someone to watch some more information about, specifically how small groups kind of live in this beta space. There's a lot of things that live in this beta space, but you mentioned that, people don't leave churches because of a lack of information. They leave it because of a lack of connection. And Barna studies show that, right? Like when people leave the church, the number one reason, this data is a few years old, but the number one reason people are leaving is because they just drifted. Well, that doesn't happen overnight. It happens because they get disconnected, right? And if you're not tethered to something, like if you're out in the ocean, you drift, right? So they just drifted. It's not like they made a conscious decision and said, I'm leaving here because of this homily. Now, I know there's somebody listening to this podcast that left for that reason, right? So I'm not saying it doesn't happen. The number one reason is because people just drift. And drift speaks to a lack of connection. And I think maybe the outcome, like to answer your question too, Tammy, here about what are the outcomes we're looking for, it's to take the next step. And then I think we get carried away and we want to take all the steps. Or we think by the time we see a little sapling grow in your greenhouse that we're ready to start like harvesting pumpkins, right? So we're not there yet. So the next step should not be thought of as only RCIA. That might be a next step for some of them, but we should probably talk about like the outcome isn't to get them in our programs. The outcome is to help them take the next step while staying connected to them. So maybe at Alpha, they prayed for the first time. Maybe they came back to faith after many years away. Maybe they're finally owning it themselves after living in a family that was very faithful, but they were just the one dutifully going to Mass on Sunday. That's a great starting point. But for that person to take a next step, it might mean I prayed for the first time. I invited the Lord to be the Lord of my life. I repented of my sins for the first time. I'm changing some of my habits. People need to be accompanied in those, because when they take those steps, it's not just like the road opens up and it all makes sense. And we're not ready for them to maybe enter the church right away. Maybe they're not living a sacramental life in the church now, or maybe they don't know why they're in the church. Those are things people need to be accompanied in. And again, back to Rob's point, right? It's relationship before information.
Okay, so that's fantastic. And again, so great that we're very highly focused on relationship and accompaniment. And now how do we do that? Because everybody's at a different phase in their faith journey. And like you gave great examples, Matt, maybe some are praying for the first time, whereas some are regular Mass attenders. And so where do we begin to accompany such a large parish, or I guess it's not even the parish. I guess right now your focus is on those people coming out of Alpha, maybe who have already taken a first step. Where do we begin?
This is where you're going to kind of step into, the expression tension to manage rather than a problem to solve, because sometimes parishes have done kind of the smorgasbord approach of where they list every possible next step that someone could take. It's like, oh, okay, so we list our CIA and we invite people back on Alpha team and we offer Bible studies or small groups, or some people are a little bit more activistic, and so we give an opportunity for serving, or maybe there's a new to the parish, event that you invite people to, right? And so you can, kind of invite. And what ends up happening in those situations is people tend to get overwhelmed with the options, and a lot of times don't choose any. And so the more narrow the options are, the more likely people are to take one. But then at the same time, that this is where you need a little bit of discernment, because not everybody's at the exact same place, right? So if you've got someone that's maybe been a long-term parishioner, very familiar with your parish, but comes to Alpha, maybe they were disconnected, or maybe they're just a little bit more of a cultural Catholic, but their faith comes alive, right? And so they've got a lot more natural connection with your parish. You take someone else that's completely unchurched, no Catholic background whatsoever. Those are a couple different starting points, right? Learning to identify that and helping people move forward. And I think this is what's helpful about creating a faith space that's relationship first is you can step into a faith space where those two people still emerge in where they are. And a wise leader knows how to create an environment that allows people to kind of function at different stages or paces of their spiritual growth around some of those things. So in general, I think we're seeing the majority of our churches, as far as the best next step, is around a little bit more like small group oriented, or some will go, some churches have experimented with connect groups, which tend to be a little bit more mid-sized groups, which are, kind of 15, 20 people, maybe even more around that. So something around that space and kind of that methodology is what churches are experimenting with in that space. Mm-hmm. The thing that I would say is part of that is making an intentional shift from the standpoint that Alpha is short-term and very intense, right? So you're coming every week for 2 to 3 hours and you're experiencing some big stuff. So you may be coming to faith and you're learning about the Holy Spirit and you're learning about healing and maybe prayer, and there's a lot coming at you in a short period of time. Yeah. You want to intentionally kind of shift that in terms of thinking longer term and less intense, right? So the intensity may be, we're not on a weekly pace, or if you're on a weekly pace, it's not 2 to 3 hours, or you're not throwing big stuff. This week we're going to help you figure out the Trinity, and next week we're going to help you figure out, whatever, right? Kind of big idea to big idea, right? It's a little bit different journey. So something generally, the majority of our churches is some type of small group, connect group methodology that the majority experiment with.
I love that, Rob, just to talk about pace. I don't even know that I've thought about it in that way before. So yeah, I'm learning. I love that. That is so good. Because it can't just stay intense all the time, right? People are going to get worn out quick.
I think that creates a challenge because we love the intensity. We love the high that sometimes comes with it, but I don't think we're wired to maintain that long term.
That's right.
And so in creating a different environment, you got to kind of shift that thinking and invite people into much more plotting or processing in that, which sometimes people are ready for. Or I think everybody needs it. Sometimes people still want kind of that intensity, which isn't really sustainable.
Which is you, Rob, kind of reiterating what we talked about at the beginning, right? We all want to jump right to the fruit stage where the plant has already gone from sprout to fruit, and instead of, again, being in that patience space and waiting for the growths to happen. Yeah, that's a good point.
I think one other thing that's resonating as we start thinking about that next spot, I think 2 things to keep in mind is what's your existing pathway, if you have one, even if it's not really a pathway, like what are your existing structures for how you accompany people? There's a church that I coach here in Texas, and they had a large church ministry, which is a retreat ministry. It's an acronym for Christ Renews His Parish. And so it's, other parishes do like Acts retreats. So it was a retreat ministry, but it's aimed at those that are ready to discover the Catholic Church, the sacraments, things like that. So Alpha, is Alpha. It's not Beta, Gamma, Delta. It's more of the basic gospel proclamation. And basic, I don't mean like simple. I mean, it starts at what the assumption is that we need to hear the gospel proclaimed and we need to decide for ourselves to give our lives to the Lord. And so these churches that had this church that had Chirp, they realized they needed to shift some of their resources to start Alpha. And for a season that was good, but then people wondered well, what about Chirp? What about Chirp? And so they were kind of vying for resources and attention in the church. And that kind of created some anxiety for both groups. But the thing they did, this was where I think this was the win, where they finally arrived at this point. Doesn't mean they figured it all out. But the point that they're trying to strive to make to their people now is, if you haven't come to faith, if you're new to faith, if you're still curious about faith, if you want to dive into what is faith for you, Alpha. If you've come to faith and are ready to take a next step, Chirp. And now they've got the resources to run both. So that's the beautiful thing about it. It's not Alpha or these retreats. but you do need to think about how you use the resources and how to position them. So you as a staff or volunteers or leaders know how to encourage people to take the right next step. And so the people know, like, okay, I can do this before I do that, or I've already done this, I need to do that, or I find myself in this spot in my faith, so this is the place that I jump into the pathway. And the other thing I would say, besides your existing structures or programs or offerings to adjust around that, is what is the success of your alpha? There's another big parish, and they're getting, this is a really big parish, they're getting like 25 people every season for alpha, which for this parish is not many. There's a smaller church in a rural parish that they have over 3 years, they've had 1,500 people come through alpha. That's more than they have registered at their parish. Wow. So the next beta for them, for 1,500 people in 3 years, is going to look different than the parish that's had 25 over 2 seasons a year, doing the math, 300 people for 3 years. That next step looks very different, because critical mass is going to make a determination on some of those next steps too.
Yeah. Isn't that amazing? It would be such a sin to lose those people, wouldn't it? Coming out of alpha, that's a huge number of people to impact. Sorry, Rob, before I go on, looks like you wanted to add to that.
Well, just one of the things that we always wrestle with here, or we've suggested in the past, I know churches are experimenting with this, is we've always said, if you're thinking in terms of developmental processes, pathways, pipelines, all that sort of stuff, don't get into the habit of letting people take alpha multiple times, because what ends up happening, people have a great experience and they come back, new people don't get brought into alpha, new people don't get developed as leaders. And so we've always said, we've always kind of taught into this principle of the only way you can come back to alpha is if you're coming back on team. And again, I think that principle still is true. You know, we'll destroy our alpha with what they call alphaholics that just want to keep coming back, and the same people have the same experience over and over again, and doesn't make space. Mm-hmm. There are churches, though, that are starting to experiment with letting people come back on alpha a second time. And this particularly is in churches where they're really reaching a lot of unchurched people that really, like, everything that alpha is talking about is completely new. And they're still functioning with the same principle. They're just making the space for, rather than letting people come only once, they are allowing people to come twice and then moving them on, not allowing a third time. And so some of our diehards that we've kind of spoken into, they're probably like, ooh, you know. I say all that again to say that you still want to function with the same principle of helping people move on. If there is the capacity, and that is and that's a methodology that helps, there are some churches that are starting to experiment. But again, one of the underlying things in all of this, whatever your experimentation is, right, and even what you were sharing before, Matt, those two contrasting churches, this is where we have to value measurement, right? And we have, or we'll talk about measuring in another podcast, depending on what order we release these in. And that's where we have to be able to look at these things and have honest conversations. And so those are safe experiments to have, as long as you're having honest conversations and you're truly measuring that stuff. Are we seeing new people come to alpha? Are we seeing people take next steps? Are we seeing people connect relationally? Mm-hmm. Or are we just cycling down and running the exact same people through over and over again and calling it success, right? So the important principle of that isn't that you do exactly what we're saying here. You know, don't fall into any traps. Mm-hmm. But if you are going to experiment with this stuff, again, have the conversation on the front end. Why are we doing what we're doing? Do it. And then have honest evaluations and measurements on the back end to see if you're having it or not.
Amen, brother.
Okay, maybe let's take a different look at it and say, where are churches struggling in this space?
It's amazing that we use the term beta for this, because and really, if you think about how we use that in our vernacular now, beta means like where you're in trial stage, right? You're trying something out, you know? Yeah. And I remember when my dad he always liked to get the gadget first or second, right? And so I remember we had a Macintosh computer with the green screen, the DOS prompts, all of that. And man, we were playing like a DOS game on that. I mean, how boring. My kids now would be like, I'm not doing that. And then I remember when the whole VCR thing came out, it was VHS versus beta.
Beta here. We had the beta.
We got a beta, right? We got a beta. My dad put his eggs in that basket. He thought beta was going to win out. And guess what? Beta didn't win out, right? So beta a lot of times means it's in trial stage, and that's okay to try some things. I know this happened like during COVID. People did it naturally. Crisis drives innovation, and it can shake us out of our existing structures. I would say right now, as people are coming back into churches, a lot of people just breathing a sigh of relief that we're back, that our programs are going again, that the church is generally full, that we're generally making budget. This is the wrong place to arrive at just like, okay, back to normal. Yeah. Like, I want us to still innovate in this space, because that's the thing you said, Tammy, like, what's this challenge? Most people haven't figured out beta, right? They're not even trying to put beta up against VCR and figure out which one's better. They just decided, I'm going to wait for somebody else to do it, right? Now, we know there's going to be new models emerge and people are going to look for those models and apply those. That's great. That's also innovation. But we need some innovators out there swimming around in this beta space, trying some things, seeing what works, like Rob said, using measurements, using your existing structures. If not, the tendency is to slip back into what we already do, which is the catechetical approach. That has a place in the pathway, by the way, folks. I'm drinking the Catholic Kool-Aid. It has a place. But unfortunately, we don't know what really is in this space. We're not structured that way. We all have like DREs, we have RCIA directors, we have all these things in place already. So you can adapt some of what you're doing. But I think more than just making a tweak or adding alpha to your RCIA program, which I do see done a lot. And that's maybe innovative, but I think we're still trying to like take alpha and plug it into what we want. But we need to start putting some resources and some man or woman power behind that beta spot and swim around. And maybe what's going to emerge as a new model for us, it might mean we're going to have to change our budgets. It might mean we need to realign our staff. It might need we need to raise up some new leaders. And by the way, your alpha needs to do that too. Like, we haven't talked about that here, but alpha also is a leadership pipeline. It's a leadership pipeline. And so when we talk about what's next, what's beta next, we're not just thinking about the guests for beta. We should be thinking about the leaders of alpha.
Right.
How are we moving them along too, right? We don't want them to get stuck in just ministering a certain way. We want to tend to their spiritual journey also. So I like to say this is like the 2-foot approach. Like, we want everybody to jump in with both feet, like if they're going to be an alpha leader, but we want them to have 1 foot in their own program what they're helping lead. And we need them to have 1 foot in their own spiritual journey, which might mean they're part of their own small group that is separate from the one they're leading. That's all stuff that needs to be considered in this beta space. And I don't think we all have a line of sight on that yet.
Okay, let's highlight that, because that's a really good one, Matt. This idea that to have that leadership pipeline, so to take a leader from alpha and have them lead in a beta, they also have to be having their spiritual tanks filled. We have to be investing in them, both in leadership skills, but also to ensure their faith life is growing, so they have something to pull from to feed others. Great point.
Yeah, I think, back to your question, you said, what's the struggle? I think, Matt touched on one. I think there's 2 key struggles: drop off and lack of next steps, and leaders to help with those next steps, right? Like, if you were to boil down 95% of all the struggles in this space are those 2 issues, I think. And Matt, you spoke a little bit more into kind of the leadership piece around that. So a lot of times when it's like, okay, well, how do we help them when you're wrestling with this? Those are probably a couple of the key challenges around that. And let me just say, I think we can do things to increase retention. I don't think we're ever going to keep 100%, right? Like, scripture is very clear. Right. Parable of the soils, right? Like, right. So I think we always have to kind of live with that tension. It's like, oh, we only had 92%. Well, how do we get 100? It's probably not even going to be 92% retention. But anyways, because here's, churches have seen this. You'll invite someone to an alpha. They'll have a great experience at it, and they don't want to do anything else. Right. And that's frustrating. It's like, you've experienced Jesus and you've had all this. And it's like, what's next for you? Hey, I just agreed to come to alpha, and I'm thankful for it, and I'm glad, but I'm going on with my life, right? It's like, and you want to reach out, just grab them and, kind of pull them into the next step. So most of what we're talking through is we're thinking through this stuff. And then that's when you're getting into the structure, the resources, and helping leaders kind of develop and move forward.
Can I mention just one more next step before we move on? And maybe this isn't where you're going to ask that question about next step, so it just might be jumping the gun. But a next step is integration in the community, right? So like where we see most of our people is at Mass. And it's okay after someone goes to Alpha, or it's okay to invite someone to Mass whenever you want. But we ought to be highlighting the fruit that's happening when the most people gather. So at Mass, like closing announcements or whenever is appropriate, like if you're going to preach on conversion, talk about you just finished an Alpha series, and maybe you're going to have somebody, share a testimony in some way, like even if it's like you capture it on video and share it on your social media. We ought to be integrating people, which also doesn't just mean you're taking the guest or the Alpha person or the front end person and integrating them into the community. The other integration has to happen too. The community needs to know. They need to hear. They need to embrace that person. Because if this is, again, about relationship, it's not just, okay, I've gone through Alpha, now I need to find my way in the church. We need the church to find their way. We need the people to embrace that. And the more we talk about integration, the more you have people in the pews that don't just see their role as to take up space, pay, pray, and obey. Yeah. We see them also as building community authentically. I know we say that a lot, but are we really doing it? And that means welcoming not just the guest or the stranger, like the gospel says, but that neophyte, that new believer, that visitor, that person that's coming to faith, because their connection to the church might mean that we've got to be that connection for them. The integration goes the other way too.
That's such a great point, Matt, because part of what we always used to talk about, or still talk about, I should say used to, but is as you recognize, and if you're trying to actually use Alpha, if you're trying to help Alpha develop the culture in your parish as well, one of the things you want to say is, okay, how are we not just helping people take next steps, but how is that next step building on the Alpha culture? Because one of the strategies that we did early on at St. Benedict was we created connect groups, which you could only get into primarily if you had been through Alpha, because we were trying to protect that Alpha culture. And eventually, once we felt that the Alpha culture was strong enough, we kind of collapsed that structure for a number of other reasons. And we went to more of one type of small group, because we believed that there was enough people through Alpha and that the culture was part of the parish enough that as we engaged in small groups who maybe hadn't been to Alpha yet, they would still experience that culture, and the non-Alpha culture wouldn't override the Alpha culture that we were trying to create in that, right? And so in that, but again, to your point, Matt, stepping back is we're thinking in terms of, how is Alpha influencing it? What's our expectations of other parishioners and leaders in it? And how can that next step continue to build on that cultural reality that you're experiencing in the wider community of the parish at the same time? There's a lot in that.
So guys, what I'm taking away from this conversation is, I think I was going into it with a higher focus on what we're doing in that space of next step, rather than approaching it from the step before that, or the mindset before that is, what are we doing to help people move into a next step? So I know we kind of bounced around a lot as I kind of tried to go in one direction and maybe you guys were going in another one. So Rob, maybe can I hand it over to you to kind of tie this up together with a framework maybe?
Sure. As you're thinking about what's next, what's next for people, really, you're trying to ask the question, what's next in their discipleship? And so you want to be intentional around thinking in terms of, okay, this is where people are at, and then here's generally some of the next steps that we want them to take in this. And then you want to say, okay, what is the best environment, space that's going to help us take the next step? And that's where you start to get in. That's probably where a lot of people are at around methodology. So what program or what material or what, and all that sort of stuff. And again, that's really a little bit more of a larger conversation with a leadership team or, kind of a small group team to kind of think through what that looks like based on your vision and your process and all that. Then you want to ask the question, okay, who's going to lead the overall ministry? What person, what team is responsible for this? Is this just also the person that's leading Alpha and this is an add-on to them? Or, who's the champion? Who's the person that's really paying attention and caring to help people take this step? And then who are the specific leaders that are going to engage and walk with these people. And again, that's just the classic tension and question that you're always asking around every ministry. You know, who's going to lead Alpha? Who's going to be part of hospitality? Who's going to, kind of working through that? And then what are the measurements and what are the things that you're going into this with that you want to pay attention to and measure with afterwards or along the journey to make sure that you're hitting your mark? And that's really the space that you'll want to get into and kind of think through before, are they going to do this Bible study? Are they going to do this material? We're going to teach them about their gifts, or we're going to teach them how to pray the rosary and all that sort of stuff. There's a place for that in that, but kind of thinking framework-wise first before you kind of step into that space.
That's good.
Here's where I'd say we leave people. There's maybe a lot of questions at the end of this, well, I don't know what my next step is. We offered a few, but really spoke into that you need to take a next step in this space. You need to pay attention to this beta space and do it in the context of your parish. And if you're struggling with that or you're not sure, guess what? We work with a lot of parishes in the same place, and that's one of the benefits, I think, for coaching. So as our coaches come alongside parishes, we want to swim in this beta space with you. We want to help you take practical steps and think through that framework that Rob just laid out.
Yeah, that's a great invitation to end on, Matt. So if you are struggling in this space and you're looking for some help, please do reach out to us through our website. If you are living in the space and you're having great success, seeing lots of fruit, we'd love to hear what you guys are doing. So please do leave your comments to share them with others. So thanks for joining us today, and we hope to see you on the next episode of the Missional Leadership Podcast. Thanks, and God bless.